Have you ever stood in front of your refrigerator, looked at yesterday's dinner, and thought, it's already cooked, so all I have to do is heat it up? Most of us have. In fact, leftovers are part of everyday life. They save time, reduce food waste, and make busy days much easier. But here's the question very few people stop to ask. Is every leftover just as safe the second time around? The answer may surprise you. Now, before anyone starts worrying that reheating food is automatically dangerous, let's clear up one of the biggest misconceptions. The act of reheating itself is not the enemy. Your microwave isn't secretly creating cancer causing chemicals, and your stovetop isn't transforming healthy food into something toxic. That's a myth, and it's important to separate myths from facts because your health deserves evidence, not fear. What really matters is everything that happens between the first meal and the second. How long did that food sit on the counter? Was it cooled quickly? Was it stored in the refrigerator at the right temperature? Has it been reheated multiple times? These are the questions that actually determine whether your leftovers remain safe or become a problem. Think about bacteria for a moment. They're invisible, they're everywhere, and under the right conditions, they multiply incredibly fast. When cooked food is left sitting at room temperature for hours, bacteria don't take a break. They begin multiplying, and some of them can produce toxins that reheating may not completely eliminate. So the issue isn't necessarily that you warm the food again. The issue is that harmful changes may have already occurred before you even press the microwave button. This is why food safety experts often talk about what's called the danger zone. It's the temperature range where bacteria grow most rapidly. The longer food stays in that range, the greater the opportunity for harmful microorganisms to multiply. That's why simply saying, I'll heat it until it's hot, isn't always enough if the food was handled improperly in the first place. There's another piece to this puzzle that many people overlook. Even when food remains perfectly safe to eat, reheating can change its nutritional value. Certain vitamins, particularly those that are sensitive to heat, gradually decline every time food is cooked again. Delicate vegetables may lose some of their beneficial compounds. Proteins can become tougher. Healthy fats can begin to oxidize after repeated heating. None of this means the food suddenly becomes poisonous, but it does remind us that freshness often provides the greatest nutritional benefit. At the same time, we shouldn't become afraid of leftovers. In fact, leftovers can absolutely be part of a healthy lifestyle. They help reduce food waste, save money, and make healthy eating more convenient. The goal isn't to throw away perfectly good food. The goal is to handle it correctly from the very beginning. That's where simple habits make an enormous difference. Refrigerate cooked food promptly instead of letting it sit out all evening. Divide large portions into smaller containers so they cool faster. Keep your refrigerator cold enough to slow bacterial growth. And when it's time to eat those leftovers, heat them thoroughly instead of just warming the surface while the center remains cool. You may be wondering why certain foods seem to come up repeatedly in conversations about reheating. Isn't all food basically the same once it's cooked? Not exactly. Different foods behave differently because of their unique composition. Some naturally contain compounds that change with repeated heating. Others provide an ideal environment for certain bacteria if they're stored incorrectly. Still others lose quality much faster than you might expect. Understanding these differences doesn't make eating more complicated. It actually makes it simpler because once you know which foods deserve extra attention, you can make better decisions without second guessing yourself every time you open the refrigerator. One thing I always encourage people to remember is that good health rarely depends on one dramatic decision. It's built through dozens of small choices repeated every day. Choosing to cool food quickly, choosing to refrigerate leftovers promptly, choosing to reheat them properly. None of these actions feels particularly important in the moment, but together they significantly reduce your risk of foodborne illness while helping you preserve the nutritional value of your meals. Throughout this discussion, we're going to examine 4 common foods that deserve a closer look before you reheat them. Some of the reasons may surprise you because they're not based on internet rumors or sensational headlines. They're based on how these foods interact with bacteria, heat, storage, and time. Once you understand the science behind them, you'll never look at leftovers quite the same way again. The safest meal doesn't begin with reheating, it begins with how you treat the food long before it reaches the microwave. Let's begin with one of the most surprising foods on the list because almost every household eats it regularly: rice. It seems harmless, doesn't it? Whether it's steamed white rice, brown rice, fried rice, or rice served alongside your favorite meal, it's one of the most common leftovers people save for the next day. Most of us assume that if we simply microwave it until it's piping hot, everything will be perfectly fine. But rice has a unique story that deserves your attention. Here's something many people don't realize. Uncooked rice can naturally contain spores from a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. Now, don't let the scientific name intimidate you. These spores are commonly found in the environment, including soil, and they can make their way onto grains before they're harvested. The important point is that these spores are incredibly resilient. Unlike many bacteria that are destroyed during cooking, these spores can survive even after the rice has been boiled. At this point, you might wonder, if the spores survive cooking, why don't they make everyone sick immediately? The answer is simple. The spores themselves aren't necessarily the immediate problem. The real issue begins after the rice has finished cooking and is left sitting out at room temperature. Imagine you've prepared a large pot of rice for dinner. Everyone eats, the evening gets busy, and the pot remains on the kitchen counter for several hours because someone plans to put it away later. During that time, those surviving spores can wake up, multiply, and begin producing toxins. Once those toxins are present, reheating the rice may not eliminate them completely. That's why food safety experts consistently emphasize proper storage rather than relying on reheating as a safety net. Notice what this means. The danger isn't created by the microwave. The danger isn't caused by reheating itself. The real mistake happened much earlier when the cooked rice was left in conditions that allowed bacteria to grow. This is an important distinction because there's a lot of misinformation online suggesting that reheated rice is automatically dangerous. That's simply not true. Millions of people safely enjoy leftover rice every single day. The difference lies in how that rice was handled after it was first cooked. So, what should you do instead? Fortunately, the solution is straightforward. Once the meal is over, don't leave rice sitting on the counter for hours. Let it cool briefly, then transfer it into shallow containers so it cools more quickly, and place it in the refrigerator as soon as practical. Ideally, within about 2 hours of cooking, or sooner if the environment is particularly warm. Shallow containers help the rice cool evenly, reducing the amount of time it spends in temperatures where bacteria thrive. When you're ready to enjoy it again, reheat only the portion you plan to eat. Heat it thoroughly until it's steaming all the way through. Stirring during reheating can help eliminate cold spots, especially if you're using a microwave. And once you've reheated that serving, it's generally best to eat it rather than cooling it down and reheating it over and over again. Each cycle of cooling and warming increases opportunities for bacteria to multiply if the food isn't handled carefully. Another practical tip is to avoid cooking far more rice than you'll realistically eat within a few days. We often prepare oversized batches because rice is inexpensive and convenient. but smaller, more manageable portions reduce waste and make safe storage easier. If you know you won't use it soon, freezing freshly cooked rice is another excellent option. Frozen rice retains its quality surprisingly well, and freezing greatly slows bacterial growth. There's also a nutritional lesson here. Rice is primarily a source of carbohydrates, and whether it's white or brown, pairing it with vegetables, healthy fats, and a good source of protein creates a more balanced meal. Leftovers can absolutely support healthy eating habits when they're prepared thoughtfully. The goal isn't to fear rice, it's to respect the way food behaves after it's been cooked. I also want to caution against another common habit. Sometimes people judge leftovers by smell alone. They open the container, take a quick sniff, and if nothing seems unusual, they assume it's safe. Unfortunately, harmful bacteria don't always produce an obvious odor, discoloration, or strange taste. Food can appear completely normal while still posing a risk. That's why relying on proper storage practices is far more dependable than trusting your senses. Remember, food safety isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. You don't need expensive equipment or complicated techniques. A few simple habits, cooling food properly, refrigerating it without unnecessary delay, storing it properly, and reheating only what you'll eat go a long way toward protecting yourself and your family. Rice is a perfect example of a larger principle that we'll see again with the other foods on this list. The food itself isn't the villain. The real issue is time, temperature, and handling. Once you understand that, you stop fearing leftovers and start managing them wisely. Healthy habits don't begin when you press the reheat button, they begin the moment the meal is over. Now let's move on to another group of foods that often sparks heated debates online: leafy green vegetables. You've probably seen alarming headlines claiming that reheating spinach, celery, kale, or beet greens turns them into something dangerous or even cancer causing. These claims spread quickly because they sound dramatic, but when we look at the science, the picture is much more balanced and much less frightening. Leafy greens are some of the most nutritious foods you can eat. They're packed with vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, fiber, and plant compounds that support overall health. In fact, eating more vegetables is consistently associated with a lower risk of many chronic diseases. So, the last thing we want is for people to become afraid of foods that can benefit their health simply because they've heard an exaggerated claim online. One reason these vegetables attract so much attention is that they naturally contain compounds called nitrates. Now, the word nitrate often makes people nervous because it has been linked in many discussions to processed meats. But it's important to understand that not all sources of nitrates are the same. The nitrates found naturally in vegetables come packaged with vitamin C, antioxidants, polyphenols, and many other beneficial nutrients. Inside the body, these compounds can actually play helpful roles, including supporting healthy blood vessel function and circulation. In other words, naturally occurring nitrates in vegetables are not automatically something to fear. So, where does the concern about reheating come from? Over the years, people have worried that repeated heating could contribute to chemical changes involving nitrates under certain conditions. While this topic has been studied extensively, there is no strong evidence that simply reheating properly stored leafy vegetables causes cancer in healthy adults. That's a very important distinction. Unfortunately, internet myths often remove all of the context and replace it with fear. What is true is that repeated heating isn't ideal for the quality of these vegetables. Every time you cook them again, some heat-sensitive nutrients, particularly vitamin C and certain B vitamins, gradually decline. The vibrant texture softens even further. The fresh flavor becomes dull. Antioxidant levels may decrease somewhat. So while the vegetables may still be safe to eat if they've been stored correctly, they may no longer offer quite the same nutritional value they did when freshly prepared. Think about spinach, for example. Freshly cooked spinach provides an impressive amount of nutrients. If you repeatedly warm and cool that same serving over several days, you aren't necessarily creating a dangerous food, but you are slowly reducing some of the very nutrients that made it valuable in the first place. The same principle applies to kale, Swiss chard, beet greens, and celery. Rather than cooking a huge batch that gets reheated again and again, it often makes more sense to prepare portions you'll enjoy within a day or two. If you do have leftovers, refrigerate them promptly and reheat only the amount you plan to eat. Another practical option that many people overlook is enjoying certain leftover vegetables cold. The chilled spinach salad made from previously cooked spinach, vegetables mixed into a grain bowl, or cold roasted vegetables added to lunch can all be delicious without exposing the food to another heating cycle. Sometimes the healthiest solution is also the simplest one. There is one additional point worth mentioning. Infants under a few months of age have unique physiology that makes them more vulnerable to problems related to excessive nitrate exposure. That's why recommendations for infant feeding differ from those for healthy adults. But this special consideration should not be generalized to everyone. Too often, information intended for a very specific group gets shared online without explanation, creating unnecessary fear for the broader population. This highlights a much larger lesson about nutrition. Context matters. Our bodies don't respond to isolated chemicals, they respond to whole foods, overall dietary patterns, and long term habits. Focusing on one nutrient while ignoring everything else can lead us to make poor decisions. If someone avoids spinach because they're worried about reheating it, yet replaces it with highly processed snack foods, they've likely moved in the wrong direction for their health. Nutrition is rarely about finding one perfect food or identifying one dangerous ingredient. It's about consistently choosing foods that nourish your body while handling and preparing them wisely. Leafy greens remain one of the healthiest choices you can make. The goal isn't to eliminate them from your diet, it's to preserve their quality by cooking them thoughtfully, storing them properly, and avoiding unnecessary repeated reheating. As we've already seen with rice, the biggest risk often isn't the reheating itself. Proper refrigeration, good food handling, and sensible meal planning make all the difference. Once again, the science points us toward practical habits instead of unnecessary fear. Don't let myths keep you from eating some of nature's healthiest foods. Protect their value by storing them well and enjoying them while they're at their best. Now let's turn our attention to another category of leftovers that many people reheat every week without giving it a second thought: seafood and chicken. Whether it's grilled salmon from dinner, baked chicken breast prepared for meal prep, leftover shrimp from a stir fry, or roasted turkey after a family gathering, these foods are excellent sources of high quality protein. They can absolutely fit into a healthy lifestyle, but they also require a little more care than many people realize. One of the biggest misconceptions is that reheating chicken or fish somehow creates harmful chemicals that dramatically increase your risk of disease. The evidence simply doesn't support that idea. Reheating these foods isn't inherently dangerous. Just like we've discussed with rice and leafy greens, the real issue is what happens before you reheat them. Protein-rich foods are especially attractive to bacteria when they're left in the wrong conditions. Imagine you finish dinner, everyone is talking around the table, the dishes are waiting in the kitchen, and the chicken or seafood sits out for several hours. During that time, bacteria can begin multiplying rapidly. Some of these bacteria can cause foodborne illness, leading to symptoms like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach cramps, and fever. Once again, the problem didn't start when you reheated the food. It started because it wasn't stored safely after the meal. That's why timing matters so much. Once you've finished eating, leftovers should be cooled and refrigerated without unnecessary delay. If you've cooked a large amount, divide it into smaller containers, rather than placing one large steaming pot directly into the refrigerator. Smaller portions cool more quickly, helping the food move through the temperature range where bacteria grow the fastest. Now let's talk about reheating itself. One common mistake is warming food just enough so it feels slightly hot on the outside while remaining cool in the center. This happens frequently in microwaves because they don't always heat evenly. If you've ever taken a bite of leftover chicken that's scorching hot on one side and cold on the other, you've experienced this firsthand. A simple solution is to stir food during reheating whenever possible, or rotate the container if you're using a microwave. Make sure the entire portion is heated thoroughly until it's steaming throughout. This helps ensure that the food reaches a temperature that reduces the risk from bacteria that may have developed during storage. Another issue people notice is that reheated chicken often tastes dry or rubbery. Fish can become flaky to the point of falling apart, while shrimp may turn tough and chewy. These changes aren't usually signs that the food has become unsafe. They're signs that proteins change structure when exposed to heat repeatedly. Think of protein like a tightly coiled spring. As it cooks, that structure changes. Reheating it again causes additional tightening, squeezing out moisture and leaving the food drier than before. That's why gentle reheating often produces better results than blasting leftovers with high heat for several minutes. Adding a splash of broth, a little water, or incorporating leftover chicken into soups, stews, or sauces can help preserve moisture. Fish can often be enjoyed cold in salads or grain bowls rather than being reheated again. These simple strategies improve both flavor and texture while reducing unnecessary overcooking. Meal preparation also deserves a mention here. Many people cook several days' worth of chicken on Sunday to simplify their busy week. There's nothing inherently wrong with this approach, provided the food is stored properly and consumed within an appropriate time frame. Meal prep can actually make healthy eating much easier because it reduces the temptation to rely on highly processed convenience foods when life gets busy. What you want to avoid is repeatedly removing the same container from the refrigerator, reheating it, letting it cool again, and placing it back into storage. Every cycle of warming and cooling creates another opportunity for bacteria to grow if the food spends too much time at room temperature. Instead, portion your meals ahead of time and reheat only what you intend to eat. It's also important to trust more than your senses. Just because chicken smells normal doesn't guarantee it's safe. Harmful bacteria don't always announce their presence with an unpleasant odor or visible mold. Safe food handling habits are far more reliable than appearance alone. Notice the pattern that's emerging as we move through these different foods. Whether we're talking about rice, leafy greens, seafood, or chicken, the same principles continue to apply. Refrigerate promptly, store food correctly, reheat thoroughly, avoid unnecessary repeated heating. These habits are remarkably simple, yet they have a tremendous impact on reducing the risk of foodborne illness. Good nutrition isn't only about choosing healthy ingredients, it's also about respecting how food changes after it's cooked. A nutritious meal prepared with the best intentions can still become problematic if basic food safety practices are ignored. On the other hand, leftovers handled properly remain a convenient, economical, and healthy part of everyday life. When you understand that safe reheating begins with safe storage, you stop relying on luck and start relying on good habits. And that's one of the smartest investments you can make in your long-term health. Now let's talk about two foods that often surprise people when they appear on lists like this: potatoes and mushrooms. They're nutritious, widely enjoyed, and incredibly versatile. You can bake them, roast them, mash them, grill them, or add them to soups and stews. Because they're such common ingredients, many people assume they're virtually foolproof when it comes to leftovers. But just as we've seen with rice, leafy greens, chicken, and seafood, it's not the food itself that's usually the problem. It's what happens after the meal is over. Let's start with potatoes. Whether they're baked, boiled, mashed, or roasted, potatoes are an excellent source of carbohydrates, potassium, vitamin C, and fiber, especially if you eat the skin. They can absolutely be part of a healthy diet. The concern begins when cooked potatoes are left sitting at room temperature for too long. Think about a family dinner. The baked potatoes stay on the table while everyone talks, dessert is served, and the evening stretches on. Hours later, someone remembers to put the leftovers away. During that time, bacteria have had an opportunity to multiply. Like many cooked foods, potatoes become much safer when they're refrigerated promptly after cooking. You've probably heard stories suggesting that reheated potatoes are toxic or automatically dangerous. That's an oversimplification. Reheating a properly stored potato isn't the issue. If the potato was cooled quickly, refrigerated, and then reheated thoroughly, it can usually be enjoyed safely. Once again, proper food handling is doing the heavy lifting, not the reheating itself. One particular reason potatoes receive attention is that under the wrong storage conditions, they can support the growth of harmful bacteria. While these situations are relatively uncommon, they reinforce an important lesson we've discussed throughout this talk. Bacteria don't care whether a food looks healthy or unhealthy. If conditions are favorable, they multiply. That's why it's wise to refrigerate leftover potatoes soon after cooking, preferably in shallow containers that allow them to cool efficiently. When you're ready to enjoy them again, reheat only the portion you plan to eat. Avoid repeatedly warming the same batch day after day. Now let's turn to mushrooms, another food surrounded by plenty of myths. Mushrooms are fascinating because they're rich in unique nutrients, antioxidants, and compounds that support overall health. They also provide a satisfying texture while being relatively low in calories, making them a favorite ingredient in balanced meals. But mushrooms have one characteristic that becomes obvious after reheating. They change quickly. Anyone who's reheated sauteed mushrooms knows they often become softer, release additional moisture, and lose some of the rich flavor they had when freshly cooked. That's because mushrooms contain a great deal of water, and repeated heating alters both their texture and taste. Some internet articles claim reheated mushrooms become poisonous or produce dangerous toxins. Fortunately, there's no strong scientific evidence supporting that claim when mushrooms have been cooked, stored, and reheated properly. Once again, sensational headlines often exaggerate isolated facts into broad warnings that don't reflect the actual science. What is true is that mushrooms, like many protein containing foods, don't improve with repeated heating. Their nutritional quality remains generally good, but their eating quality declines. Instead of reheating mushrooms multiple times, consider incorporating leftovers into another dish the very next day. Add them to an omelet, mix them into a soup, toss them into a salad if appropriate, or combine them with whole grains and vegetables for a quick lunch. Meal planning can also make a tremendous difference. Rather than preparing an oversized batch that sits in the refrigerator all week, cook amounts that realistically match your household's needs. This reduces waste while ensuring that the food you eat is fresher and more enjoyable. There's another lesson hidden in these examples. We often spend enormous amounts of energy worrying about dramatic health threats while overlooking the simple daily habits that have a much greater impact. People search for miracle foods, detox diets, or secret supplements, yet forget something as basic as putting leftovers in the refrigerator promptly. In reality, protecting your health usually isn't about discovering an extraordinary trick. It's about consistently practicing ordinary habits. As you've probably noticed by now, Every food we've discussed follows the same underlying pattern: rice, leafy greens, seafood, chicken, potatoes, and mushrooms. Each have their own unique characteristics, but the practical advice remains remarkably consistent. Refrigerate promptly, store food properly, reheat thoroughly, avoid leaving cooked food at room temperature for extended periods, and don't repeatedly heat and cool the same leftovers. These aren't complicated rules. They don't require expensive gadgets or specialized knowledge. They're simple routines that quietly protect you every single day. When practiced consistently, they greatly reduce the risk of foodborne illness while helping preserve the quality and nutritional value of the meals you've worked hard to prepare.